he is or has been in the impact arena for over 20 years. He is investing in nature-based solutions and not so much in tech-based solutions, which is a very interesting way to look into the solution spectrums that we have for the challenge ahead. So, Matt, why don't you come here? Matt Leggett, a big round of applause.
Hi. Okay, so the worst thing about coming last is that you're probably all half asleep, but the best thing about coming last is I can disagree with everything everybody said. And no one has anything to say back, so it's great. Hold on one sec. And it also means I can give you lots of nice pictures of fluffy things in wild places, which is really what we're here for, right? Okay, so let's see, hopefully this works. Am I pointing this at you? Yeah. So this is what I'm going to try and attempt to talk about. I'm going to try and attempt to talk about why nature is important. To some extent, I'm preaching to the choir here, but as somebody once told me, the best presentations start by preaching to the choir and end by shouting at the priest. So then I'll go into what are the challenges we need to solve, what's the problem we're looking at here, what on earth are nature-based solutions. You had a bit of an intro earlier on. I'm going to talk a bit more about that. Why it's not working, why we're slightly stuck, and that's a good healthy debate to have in half an hour. And then probably most importantly, where next. I think fundamentally, and if I stand here, hopefully you can see the slides, and maybe I can walk around. Fundamentally, this is really the kind of the start, the finish, and the everything of really what we're trying to do. We can't really tackle society's problems unless we fundamentally look at the nature that's underpinning. You've all heard of the SDGs, you've seen the SDGs, probably until you're sick of them. Can anyone in the room name more than 3? Ooh, there's always one. I struggle, because there's a lot. But this slide is quite fun, because basically what it says is the SDGs rest on a pyramid, on a hierarchy. At the bottom of the hierarchy, essentially all the SDGs relate to nature. So whether that's stuff on land, stuff in water, things related to our basic needs that we access from nature every day, and everything else, all the other complexities around the KPIs and indicators of the SDGs all rest on a foundation of nature. So this diagram's quite nice sometimes, because I do get sucked into quite existential conversations with people who are sort of talking about these economic pillars, how to achieve certain things, but none of it really is worth a bag of beans unless you figured out what to do about nature at the bottom. Okay. This is probably, I don't know if you've seen this. This is a fun thing that came out around the time of COVID and all that chaos. The cartoonist, I spoke to the cartoonist a couple of years ago. The cartoonist started with COVID-19 and recession, and he had so much response from that. He kept adding waves, climate change, biodiversity collapse. And this is actually just a really nice, simple visual, because it really tells us that we should all be telling fundamentally is that we have economic problems, we have health issues and pandemics, we have climate change, which is going to affect everybody, but underneath and above all of it is the biodiversity that sustains us all. So the big challenge, there's a bunch of them. I'm going to go through a few big challenge slides, so be patient. There's a lot of people that depend on nature for daily needs. If you go back to that first slide on SDGs, this is somewhat of a fictional number because kind of everybody does. But at most recent best estimates, nearly 3 billion people daily require access to nature for survival. What that means when it comes down to the economic numbers, that's a very, very large number of GDP, which is connected to nature and biodiversity. And perhaps one of the most interesting numbers is the one really right on the right-hand side, which is that we have an annual gap in financing for nature and biodiversity, which is around 700 billion. Sounds like a very, very big number, but as we'll see later on, it's perhaps less big than you might realise. And what do we do about that? What do we do about trying to drive more finance into nature One of the answers has come up early on. Renato's great introduction is this idea of nature-based solutions. There's a lot of chat about how you define a nature-based solution, but basically, most fundamentally, it's things that you can do that protect, manage, and restore ecosystems. And in those actions, they can have benefits for society. That can be as expansive as definitions you like, but that's really what it boils down to. It's become a commonly used term, but it's also becoming quite contested. I know, for example, in Indonesia, the idea of nature-based solutions is actually quite a contested term. People believe that it equates to a carbon market. My colleague at the back giggling, as we've had this conversation a lot. Which is not the case. Nature-based solutions is far, far broader than carbon. It's not just carbon. It's biodiversity, it's water, it's health. It's a much, much bigger issue than just carbon. And increasingly, when I didn't actually introduce myself. I should do that, shouldn't I? Let me pause. My name is Matt Leggett. I have been working for 20 years in the environment and climate and biodiversity space. I saw the birth and death of the first carbon market, and then now the rebirth. I spent probably 5 or 6 years of my life living in hammocks. I've been to every tropical rainforest around the world. I've worked at the UN level negotiating policy and climate change policy. I've worked with developing country governments negotiating climate change policy. And I've also been very heavily involved in community development. In fact, I'm an anthropologist by training. Spent a lot of my formative years in Papua New Guinea. So I have tried, kind of somewhat accidentally, to spend a lot of my time at community level and a lot of my time at international policy level. And everything I'm talking about today is an outcome of both of those levels of experience. Pretend I did that with him. I forgot my point now. Let's move on. I'm sure it'll come back to me. So, why is nature important? Like, how do we get more money into nature? Fundamentally, that's really the answer that we need to find. So, nature-based solutions. We have protect, we have manage, and we have restore. There's a lot of argument about how valuable nature is to solve the climate crisis. Estimates vary, as they always do, but it's a very, very large number that nature-based solutions can provide to abate global emissions. Depending on your calculations, upwards of 30% is typically the received wisdom. In Indonesia, it's much, much higher than that. As a tropical forest country, it's much, much higher. The vast majority of emissions abatement potential in Indonesia comes from forests, as it does in many forested countries, and then it comes down to agriculture and farming. It comes down again. At the base of that pyramid is marine ecosystems. But Indonesia itself has around 22% of global capacity for nature-based solutions provision. So it's a huge number. The only competitive country in that kind of level is Brazil, unsurprisingly, given the forest cover. And so it's incredibly important, basically, is the point that I'm trying to make with this slide. If we don't deal with nature, we will not deal with climate. It is an impossibility that the two things will be met separately. So we can talk about technological solutions, and we can talk about carbon capture and storage, and we can talk about the kinds of things that are being touted as the fix. But if we do not deal with nature, if we do not figure out how to protect, manage, and restore ecosystems, nothing else matters. If we figure out how to protect, manage, and restore ecosystems, we have a lot more flexibility about the other ways we can use solutions. So what does this all mean, fundamentally? How do we get more money to nature? This is just an example. So in the kind of climate environment world, we talk about three things. We talk about stocks, we talk about flows. So stocks are basically things in a wilderness area, the biodiversity in that place, the kind of the natural capital, the natural wealth of that system. The flows are the things that we get from that system, or are produced by that system, whether that's regulating services for water. Lots of forests create a lot of clouds, which create a lot of rainfall. And then the value, benefits to business and society, that's, in that context, it would be the fact that we're getting regular rainfall, and regular rainfall allows us to produce regular crops, which allows us to create regular food flows. So in the example, just to kind of try and square the circle here, if, for example, there's a company which is doing sustainable cocoa production, and in the process of creating this company, they decide, well, what we need to do is, as well as growing cocoa, we need to plant more native forests. That's good, because what it does is it helps restore forest cover. and then obviously restores the biodiversity in those forests. It helps stabilize biodiversity, so it allows animals and plants to come back to a level of stability. And it ultimately reduces deforestation and degradation in that system. What that can do is that protects and regulates watersheds, so we get less floods, we get more regular river flows. When it's wet season, you actually get water. When it's dry season, you don't. Predictability is a really key aspect of how humans rely on nature. As soon as we don't have predictability, systems fail. So one of the things that we're seeking is predictability in the way in which these systems return to balance. We even have things like pollination services, often understudied, but there's a great paper that came out not long ago about rice. You surround rice fields with forests, unsurprisingly, you get better yields. And you get better yields because pollination is much, much more predictable. And the values, the benefits to society, there's a bunch of examples there on the right-hand side. So, you know, better health, water's cleaner, there's more of it. We have local temperatures are lower. Big problem in Brazil right now around some parts of Brazil is incredibly outlandish temperatures. Like ground temperatures are going through the roof. You know, if you're in a forest area, temperatures are incredibly stable, typically in the tropics around sort of 28 to 31. In Brazil now, some of those forest areas are getting up to 40, 41 to 42 as a result of mass deforestation elsewhere. And there's a great, I highly recommend you sort of Googling some of this stuff, but there's a great paper written about Brazil about flying rivers, which is really fun. This guy basically, you know, back in the beginning of canopy science days, realized that the amount of evapotranspiration that was going on from the Amazon forest was creating rivers of condensation, which were traveling across Brazil and across South America and depositing rainfall in agricultural production areas. As we reduce the amount of forest that's available, those flying rivers get cut, and those agricultural production areas become deserts. So there's some beautiful examples of how nature-based solutions can have not only local impacts, but also interregional impacts and global impacts. That was a total side trip. Okay, the even bigger challenge. This is the first one was a big challenge. This is the slightly bigger challenge. We aren't investing enough. There's just not enough money. That's not to say there's not enough money out there. There's actually a lot of money out there seeking investment, but we're not putting enough of it into nature. We need to double it by 2025. This is a terrifying number. At the moment, 17% of the amount of money that's currently going into nature-based solutions, only 17% comes from companies, comes from private investors. That's a despicably low number, given that what we're trying to do here is change food systems, change energy systems, change systems which all connect to humanity, and yet, we're not able to put or direct more than 17% of private investment into nature. So there's a problem there. And then this is another problem. I think this came up maybe. I can't remember who mentioned this earlier, it might have been Tommy. This idea that even if we redirect financing towards nature, there's this other problem. There's another tsunami of money, which is going the other way. So fuel subsidies, subsidies for palm oil clearances, subsidies for cheap food products that are damaging the planet. So there's a real problem inherent in the system here too. And that problem often is outside of the scope of the private sector to solve. That's often a government regulatory issue which was to be tackled. So the bigger challenge. So, I mean, we talked about earlier on, the nature financing gap, 700 billion a year needed. What we've got right now is 26 billion out of a global pot of 87 trillion. Now, if you did that in piles of rice, 26 billion would be a pretty big pile of rice grains. 87 trillion would be bigger than the school campus. So there's an issue. There's a fundamental issue. And yet, all of the things that we talk about, all of these investment strategies, everything in some way connects to nature and takes from nature. So whether you're a Facebook and you sort of, you're kind of, in theory, 2, 5, 10 steps removed from nature, you're actually very much embedded and connected to those systems. This is the only texty bit, really, so apologies in advance. I'm going to try and keep this as entertaining as possible. I may have to dance. Okay, so it should be really entertaining, trust me. Look, so the problem is that the way in which, and this is personal opinion, I should caveat everything I'm about to say with the fact that this is not been certified or approved by anyone. the problem that we have right now is that we lionize and idolize a system which generates innovation through only one very, very narrow channel, which essentially is, the private equity venture capital space. It encourages and forces, and to some degree then pushes down innovation in different forms. Because what we're looking for in the venture capital private equity space is unicorns. We're looking for the Facebooks, we're looking for the WeWorks, maybe not the WeWorks. We're looking for the LinkedIns, the big things that make big returns fast. And nature doesn't work like that. We cannot apply a venture capital private equity model to nature without expecting there to be some challenges. That's not to say that there aren't good examples out there of how this can be done, but it isn't going to solve the problem at scale, which is why now you see this. I don't know if anyone's seen this stuff recently about carbon capture and storage, technological carbon capture and storage using factories to suck carbon out of the air in some form, read fake trees, pump that into the ground and store that in the ground. All being funded by oil and gas companies and is getting huge amounts of money, despite the fact that the cost per carbon ton is enormous. And the reason it's getting so much money is because VCs and impact investors can see a very clear trajectory of where this is going. It doesn't mean it's particularly good for nature. It doesn't bugger all for nature, to be honest. But you can see that it fits into their model of investment. So there's a problem, because these businesses almost always rely on negative externalities. So they basically rely on damage. And by default, the companies that are doing the other thing, the companies that are sort of the unicorn potentials are pretty rare. So when investors look at this space, they think, well, there's probably only 10 or maybe 20 of these companies I'm going to find in the next decade. So actually, I think I'm just going to invest in building bridges and railways. It's much easier, it's much more predictable. So a lot of the nature-based opportunities for investment are invisible. This came up earlier. I think Tommy made this point, which is a very good point. Ticket sizes. If you're an investor and you have a lot of money, you need to put large amounts of money in a few places, not tiny amounts of money in thousands of places. And the investment model, of course, then pushes you in a certain direction, pushes you towards certain types of investments. Most nature-based companies or most nature-based solutions need pretty small amounts of money to get going. And therefore, most of the time, they are actually invisible to mainstream investors. Capital's not patient. One of the things that I say a lot is that we recognize the urgency of the crisis, that we have patience to move at the speed of nature. And this is not true of most institutional investors. They want returns fast, they want it to be predictable, and they want to get out and move on to the next thing. And that doesn't really work in a nature-based economy. Even if you walk into a farm and you want to plant, the next great crop, which is going to double yields and really help farmers and do wonderful things, you're not probably, in most cases, not even going to get a single harvest out of a 7-year timescale. And that's not enough it's not fast enough for, standard investment approaches. Essentially all this adds up to just disincentivizing founders. I mean, there's a lot of smart people around Southeast Asia who have great ideas. I think Renato made the point early on that we actually have a lot of the solutions already. The reason these solutions are not getting scaled is because money is not helping them get there. And it just disincentivizes, progress. So lack of companies being built, which means there's less companies, which means investors are less interested. So there's a cycle of negativity going on around investing in nature. I think maybe Tommy talked about risk. One of the problems is, your standard investor will go, well, can I get my money back in 5 years? They won't say, oh God, if I don't invest in this, then my kid's not going to get clean water at school. The way in which risk is assessed is wonky. We're not looking at risk the way it should be looked at. So we end up being a frog in a pot. We end up the temperature getting turned up and turned up and turned up and turned up. And by the time we realize, it's too late. Because we are looking at the risk of, the risk and roll. This is a sort of a kind of get out of jail free card for a lot of investors. The way in which we have built the financial system is wonky. It makes it hard for investors to invest in the things they should put money into, even if they are the most committed, driven investors out there. I think, again, Tommy said, raising a fund is super hard. Trying to get people to trust you with their money, and then trying to kind of convince those people that, so we're going to invest in these really early stage things that may or may not work, and they're all to do with nature, and it's a bit unclear, and in 10 years' time, we think it's going to be good, but please just trust us and leave us alone. That's a really hard sell. What they want to hear is, you give us your money, you're going to get 10% back over 5 years, and that's very, very hard to do. Well, this is a personal bugbear of mine, carbon tunnel vision. Most investment these days into nature-based solutions is in some form connected to carbon, which is wonderful and good and healthy, and it's the carbon mechanism. Carbon, I've been very involved in it for years, and is a brilliant way of transferring finance to protect things that are important. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for biodiversity and nature. But you need to separate those things in your mind. You can have the most incredible carbon emissions mitigation abatement project, which is sucking methane out of something and getting somebody in Switzerland to pay a large amount of money for it. It will have bugger all impact on whether you're saving tigers, or whether there's a species rebound in Java language, right? And it's those indicator things which actually ultimately determine the overall health of the ecosystem, determine the ability of that ecosystem to provide the services for the communities in that area. And like I said, with the flying rivers example in Brazil, that's the kind of thing that can have macro level impact. And ecosystem services are broadly undervalued. We are starting to figure this out. Biodiversity credits, you may have heard of, biodiversity offsets even. There's ways in which we're starting to think about valuing a broader set of things that come from nature, but we haven't got there yet. This is fairly familiar to all of you who live in Bali. This is Denpasar, one of the tips in Denpasar. And this is good in the sense because what is, arguably, I kind of use this sort of slide a little bit tongue in cheek, but what's the biodiversity impact of that? What's the carbon impact of that? Depending on how you choose your metric, what you think is important, how you measure, you have two very different answers to whether it makes sense to invest in a circular economy company that deals with this problem, whether you would invest in a company which captures the methane from this problem, or whether you'd invest in a company which is just offshore on the reef, which is dealing with the outcome of having rubbish being dumped on a marine ecosystem. 3 different companies, 3 different types of measurements, 3 different types of metrics, and potentially 3 different types of investors. So, this idea that nature is inherent in trying to tackle things like this is not always the case. Okay, so where next? So I kind of promised myself that I wasn't going to talk very much about what I do, which I run a company called Terratai. I'm the CEO and founder of Terratai. And I might leave that for the questions at the end. But the reason I say that is because the very first point is what I do, and what we do. So we are trying to tackle this problem of building pipeline. How do we build more companies that are having impact on nature and biodiversity? How do we find them? How do we co-create them? How do we support the founders and the entrepreneurs? How do we take them to the point where they're small companies and then take them to a place where an institutional investor could come in and say, yes, this makes sense to me. Yes, I can now engage. We fill that gap, we fill that missing middle, and it's a real challenge in this space. I think Bruce was talking about greenwashing. We need to look really closely at impact. In this space in particular, there's a real epidemic of greenwashing, where you say something you want to be true, but actually you have no idea of knowing whether it is true. So there's a lot of that going on. Impact investing is such a flexible term in the minds of many investors, and there's so little oversight that you need to be very cautious when you are talking to somebody that's talking about impact investment, because it can mean everything from, I've designed an app that can allow people to understand where they buy their food, to I save tigers, and everything in between. And that's not rubbishing either of those things, but if you're going into it thinking impact is one thing in your head, and they're thinking impact something else in their head, then there's often a disconnect. Philanthropy. I didn't mention the role of philanthropy. So in the world of investment, we don't often talk about grants. People who work in the impact investment space don't have that experience, they don't understand. Rightly or wrongly, that's where I come from. I come from the world of grants, and I spent a lot of my life raising grants to do things. And I think philanthropy has a key role in stepping up into this space. And increasingly we're seeing the role of grants to unlock private sector investment, which is fundamentally important, because it means that investors can start taking on more risk, It means that grant donors can start expanding the scope of their impact, and it really is a match made in heaven if it's done well. So philanthropy and grant donors really need to step up. I think going back again, to the existential question of what can I do? What can I do about it? It's one of the things that if you are out there and you do have money and you are thinking about doing something in this space, there's a really interesting place to play in the kind of grant venture philanthropy kind of space. How do we give money which will ultimately lead to greater impact, ultimately build companies which will have greater impact? And I guess the bottom one, which you probably gathered from my chat, investors need to step up. Investors need to shift their mindsets. I think, as I said, the problem with the impact investment space or the VC space in particular, we're looking for unicorns. We don't need to look for unicorns. There's probably only 10 out there. We need to look for deer or flamingos or something which is really common and probably not that exciting, but we need thousands and thousands and thousands of them and not 10 unicorns if we're going to solve some of these nature-based solution challenges. So the question that we have in our minds in Terratai is often how do we build resilient companies that can achieve scale, not just companies which can get 100x on returns or 200x on returns. And I think this is an Einstein quote as well, or I've ripped it off from somewhere, but we can't solve the solutions, we can't solve the problems we face now with the solutions that created them. We have to come up with new ways of putting money into these problems. And if we don't, we can't expect different outcomes. You probably can't read this. I apologize. I wanted to put this in because I didn't want to leave it on a negative note, and I've got 3 minutes left. So, what's exciting for me? In fact, it's a terrible slide. I apologize. It's embarrassing. So there's a black thing here at the bottom which I can't tell you about. And it's just forget it. So look, what's exciting for me? There's a bunch of things that are exciting. So I want you to visualize this slide. You have to work with me here. You may need to close your eyes. Business models with systemic impact on this side here. Over here, intact ecosystems. This is like standing forest, beautiful forest full of wildlife and animals and jungle bookie type cool things. Over here, we're at the frontiers of those places where they've been degraded, slightly damaged, people are living in these locations. Mosaic landscapes where you've got people growing things, but there's also patches of forest around. And then over here, super degraded, so like monocultures, palm oils, all these kinds of things. So there's this sort of ecosystem transition. And within that transition, there's a bunch of things that are super exciting right now in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, and generally globally. So business models that directly prevent ecosystem conversion. How do we just stop that happening? Like at ground zero. That has huge impact on emissions abatement potential globally. Indonesia has enormous capacity to do cool things too. And then as we go this way, we've got everything from technology and data tools that improve management of biodiversity, production protection models. So how do we produce more on less land at less damage? Payments for ecosystem services, biodiversity credits, forest carbon. How do we finance rewilding, regeneration? How is that going to be done? How do we capture the values from those things? Marine supply chains, smart fishing, algae from fish, seaweed, pharmaceuticals that come from the marine environment. Financial mechanisms and tools. How do we get more money to people who need it in the places where it's needed most? How is that money not stuck in Jakarta? How do we get it out of Jakarta into the hands of somebody in Indonesia who's a smart person who's got a great idea for business? Is that loans? Is it grants? Is it a combination of the two? Tech and data tools that support traceability and transparency. I forget again, maybe it's Tommy again said, one of the things that's interesting at the moment is regulation is changing the landscape of how we do and talk about investments in nature. The EU recently issued a new law on deforestation, which is essentially saying, we need to see and know what's coming into the EU to understand whether it's associated with deforestation. I had the misfortune of being a drafter of that law. It was really, really complicated to try and draft. But it's enormous because it means if a product comes out of Indonesia, by the time it reaches the EU, you need to have some level of traceability to say where that's come from. And if you cannot provide it, you cannot sell it in the EU. So it's huge. How do we track and trace all that? There's tools and systems right now. When I was looking at orangutan research when I was 19, we were in the jungle in Borneo, joyfully bouncing along, being pooed on by orangutans. I was taking away all this data from a paper map and having to translate that paper map into a different paper map to put that on a word processor to then try and get my analysis to my professors. Now I can go on my laptop and I can tell you 3 days ago what happened in one particular site in Kalimantan related to deforestation. I can also tell you who's growing what. I can tell you where the farmer is, or which farmer owns that particular piece of land, and with the right kind of systems and tools that exist now, I can even transfer that farmer money to say, please don't do that again. So the landscape of this conversation has changed radically in 20 years. So yeah, these are the things that I'm super excited about. Yeah, this is just a cute monkey. Okay, thank you.